For those of you who don't know me, I'm the lead author of the foundation document for TARGET30, and my role tonight is to take you through some of the specifics of TARGET30 and what it might mean for Australia. As David outlined, we've come through a period of extraordinary economic growth in this country, with sustained increases of GDP stretching back for decades. Yet in spite of these unique circumstances, the size of government in Australia has grown and grown and grown. Spending across all three levels of government has increased at an average rate of more than 4% per year since 1972. And today, as has already been outlined, the government rakes in more than a third of everything the country produces. Governments have been spending in bad times, trying to buy their way out of recessions, and governments have been spending in good times to spread the benefits of the boom. And across the world, decades of these misguided policies have created bloated governments and societies in crisis. But TARGET30 is not about what we've done wrong in the past. TARGET30 is about the future. And in the future, Australia is facing substantial challenges from an ageing population, from rising healthcare costs, and expected slower economic growth. These conditions mean that government could exceed 50% of GDP by 2050, burdening future generations with higher taxes, higher debts, and a further breakdown in society. The CIS has launched the TARGET30 campaign to try and break these trends and to prepare Australia to meet these future challenges. TARGET30 promotes the benefits of smaller government and aims to reduce government spending to less than 30% of GDP in the next 10 years. The initial research in TARGET30 will focus on health, welfare and education, because together these areas make up more than 60% of government budgets. And TARGET30 will focus on ways that these essential services can be delivered efficiently and effectively while reducing some of the wasteful spending. And there's a lot of wasteful spending. Currently, government spends approximately $60 billion a year more than it should. Without TARGET30, governments could be wasting $150 billion a year by 2021. We cannot and should not meekly accept that future tax rises are inevitable because of claims that government doesn't have enough money to meet its basic obligations. Government spends about $500 billion a year, and many spending programs are either completely unnecessary or very poorly designed. The failures of government in areas such as defence and infrastructure should be put down to incompetence, not to underfunding. However, the forces of big government marshalled against us are enormous. Government spending has created a legion of vested interests with incentives to vote for even greater largesse. We estimated that nearly half of all voters in the 2010 elections were receiving the majority, if not all, of their income directly from the government. And these difficulties in reducing spending are why TARGET30 is proposing practical and achievable targets for reducing government spending. It's a target that can be met just by holding spending constant in per capita terms. It is a compromise between what is economically ideal and what is realistic. Subsequent papers in the TARGET30 campaign will deal in a lot more detail with specific ways to cut spending, but there are some practical steps that we can take right now that will put us on the right track to meeting this target. And a good starting point for the next government is an audit of all existing government programs and departments to determine what programs are really necessary and what programs are actually effective in meeting people's needs. Obvious areas of waste and inefficiency should be cut immediately. This includes the billions that's paid in corporate welfare to foreign car makers and others, and the massive duplication of functions at the state and Commonwealth level. To meet the challenges of an ageing population, we must spur improvements in public sector efficiency and productivity, especially in aged care and in hospitals. We need to encourage competition and let consumers make meaningful choices through the use of things like user charges and by being much more explicit about the true cost of government subsidies in areas such as public transport and pharmaceutical benefits. We must also focus on public sector workforce productivity by appropriately rewarding good performers, but making it easier to remove poor performers. We can create a competitive advantage for our economy by cutting red tape and government wheel spinning. Reducing welfare churn alone would go a long way towards meeting the Target 30 goal. One of the things that you can see from tonight and from the documents we've prepared is that Target 30 is not an austerity campaign. It's not a scare campaign. It won't propose abolishing welfare or any radical reforms like that, and it's not about punishing the poor. What it's about is asking Australians to stop demanding more and more services from the government that they would like but don't want to pay for, and start focusing more on things that we really need. We at the CIS are excited to bring the Target 30 campaign to you, and we hope that you'll add your voice to the fight for smaller government, because as Greg said, smaller government means a bigger future for us all.
David Murray said something about electing representatives who would do something about all this. I'll tell you what, it's got nothing whatever to do with that. The representatives who we vote for are chosen by the factions in the political parties. And if they don't go along with the faction, doesn't matter what the hell they think about this. Sorry to say that, but that's the fact.
There's a set of beliefs that you can be Labor or Liberal, left or right, faction A, faction B, and all that's allowed to cloud the discussion rather than a discussion about value and merit and progress and prosperity.
Morris, anything to add to that? I think what I would add to that is that Target 30 is not intended to be a political campaign. We're not targeting one side of politics or the other. We think the ideas that we're talking about here are practical and achievable solutions for cutting waste, and they're designed to be able to take it by whatever government is in power. Obviously, there are some issues, I think, around some of the factionalism and the fact that at the moment politics seems to be so antagonistic. But what we've outlined in this paper and what David was talking about tonight are some serious challenges that will be confronting Australia as a society and the burdens that we're putting on future generations. And I think that's a bipartisan issue. And once we get past this election campaign of 6-8 months or however long it is, hopefully we'll see some serious policy debate about some of these issues.
Simon, a question for you. In your numbering as to just how many departments, bureaucrats, how much government we actually have, are you actually factoring in a number for all the allegedly non-government organisations which various levels of government subsidise to the hilt to indirectly provide goods and services?
That's a good question, and it's certainly something that we're looking at. One of the real challenges that we found in preparing Target 30 is that it's very difficult to get an accurate measure of how big government really is. One of the things that we noticed in various policy areas is that people don't actually know how many programs government have. They don't know how much government's spending. And if you look at some of the figures produced by quite reputable organisations, there are variations of tens of billions of dollars in the amount that is spent by government. One of the things that we are hoping to do as part of this campaign is really get down into some of the areas within the bigger departments where there is waste and duplication of programs. And that, I think, is one of the issues that you're talking about. There is some duplication of programs across the private sector and the public sector, and to an extent the public sector is crowding out a lot of the things the private sector would be doing anyway. One of the benefits of smaller government, by removing government from that conversation, you allow the private sector to start taking over those functions again.
Do you intend to influence the corporate sector? I see a lot of calls in various sectors for welfare, and if you're in business, you are really on the outer if you speak out against it. So how and by corporate, it's not necessarily the large end of town, it can be even small business associations who seem to be jumping on the bandwagon of training and all sorts of other things, often even driven by the executive in small business associations, not all of them. But I think that's a very important area. I'm seeing a lot of growth in the belief that this is good and right in business to be calling for useless money to be spent in completely useless ways. And in business, you can't speak out against it without being sort of feeling that someone might come and get you in the middle of the night.
David, would you like to...
Well, I think the greatest service you can do in business to your community is run a business well. And that, if run well, it means that...
Sorry. It's not the individual business people who are the problem, and it's not all business associations, but many business associations, the careerism of people who run the associations, they do not lead the businesses within that business to look to policy that has long-term benefits for the businesses and the country. They look to promoting to their members short-term handouts. They also look to their own career so they can get more government money. They can have bigger empires within the association. It's a serious problem.
I was coming to that. But you have to understand first that the greatest thing you can do for a community is to run a business well, where the profit you make is reflected in the value you add to your customers and in a development sense to your employees. Now, that is often overlooked and clouded by the discussion of corporate social responsibility. Business associations can be easily captured by their secretariat, and they become commentators on everything but not much help to their own members. What has happened is that they've been given a huge carrot, particularly in things like the training agenda, safety agendas and everything else, to actually turn themselves into businesses. And what this has done is to aid and abet the process of over-regulation. One example, there is an act in New South Wales called the Fines Act. And there is what's called the moiety provisions of the Fines Act, which go back to pre-King George VI or something, in which it's possible for a fine collected to be shared with somebody in the private sector who helped collect the fine. Not necessarily in a modern society, but there were some arguments for it in the old days. Now, in the industrial law, if an organisation, such as a bank, is accused of allowing a safety incident to happen without due process, concern, procedure, then an action can be brought by a trade union to the employer or a representative of WorkCover who are generally ex-trade unionists, and the fine is shared between the Crown and the union. Now that is corrupt. That is corrupt. Now when we opposed that on those grounds, we find that one of the biggest business organisations in Australia had got in there before us, arguing that they would help sort this through and help with redrafting, but it didn't go away. So you're right.
Morris, would you like to add anything to that?
Well, I think I agree with David. I mean, what you find is that business associations tend to be captured, usually by the lowest common denominator within the association, and also, of course, by government, and government regulators are always trying to get their influence through these associations. Rent-seeking is alive and well. We see it in particular in environmental issues and in particular climate issues, and especially when it comes to renewable energy. I mean, if we look at the carbon tax, it really is just the tip of the iceberg. The real cost is in subsidies which go to solar, wind and other renewables, where in fact you have a wealth transfer from the poor to the rich. And yet this is sanctioned by government, but it obviously is attractive to the companies who are concerned and who are able to influence government to lend the taxpayers' dollars, or not lend, give the taxpayers' dollars to these people. So it's an issue, and It's a part of what has been encouraged in our society for so long.
My question refers to Mr. Murray's comments about labour costs and productivity. He mentioned that the high labour cost is decreasing productivity. Productivity can be increased by two ways. Of course, one by slashing wages and costs, and the other one is if someone has a good idea and the savings to implement that idea, you can, for a new machinery, a worker can have an increased output. For example, a new machine, instead of 1 light bulb per hour, can produce 10,000 light bulbs per hour. That to get the savings, one would need the government to be smaller government, so there will be more investment capital for the private sector to invest in such technology and so forth. Do you think Target 30 would be sufficient to, in a way that the labour costs can increase and productivity can increase simultaneously? Is it sufficient at that level to increase both productivity and higher labour costs at the same time?
Well, that's the perfect outcome. And the only sustainable way of increasing labour costs is through higher productivity. In my experience, simply slashing costs has the opposite effect. Whereas programs which increase the engagement of the workforce, increase the capacity and training of the workforce, and invest in continually upgrading the capital stock, keeping it within its useful life, not letting it waste, those programs seriously increase productivity, which is the only sustainable way of making wage rises. But there are many impediments to that. There are no trade-offs in wage negotiations for tangible productivity improvement, and the regulatory system keeps putting more impediments in the way of the capital deepening process that you talked about. The unfortunate thing is that if the currency falls, that capital deepening process gets harder. But we still have to pursue productivity improvement.
And if I could just add to that, from my perspective, two of the things that are, I think, important. One is that we really do need to focus on public sector workforce productivity, because there are such large gains that can be made there. And one of the biggest benefits from a program designed to smaller government is really to try and remove some of the restrictions and the red tape that is just crippling the public sector and the private sector as well. By removing government from some of these functions, by stopping government from interfering in every step of the process, we allow the market to generate more productive outcomes. And so certainly from our perspective, we think that Target 30 will have that effect and that benefit.
John Stone. The only regret I have about the name of this program is that it should have been Target 25. After all, about 70, I think, or 80, might have been 80 years ago, one of Australia's most distinguished economists, Colin Clark, actually said that he did not believe that any economy could, in the developed world, they didn't use those terms in those days, could function efficiently with expenditure more than 25% of GNP. He was one of the inventors of GNP, by the way. Now, that said, you would, of course, have to allow maybe 20 years, not 10 years, to achieve that objective. I just say two other things. First, I think David said, and I think Greg Lindsay may also have said originally, that they believed that smaller government meant faster growth and a better outcome for people's real incomes. I happen to agree with that, but I'd have to say that I think that just to say that is regarded by most people as a glib statement of belief or faith, if you like, or even ideology, but not provable, so to speak. So I think if this program is to be successful, we have to be very conscious of that deficiency, or that gap in the argument, if you like, and point out and be able to develop programs accompanying it, showing why this is the case, in particular, of course, by cutting taxes. I mean, after all, I understand that with a big structural budget deficit, cutting tax is not necessarily the first thing you have to do, but it shouldn't be very far behind the first thing you have to do. My final point is to do with the matter of productivity. It's been raised by a couple of speakers, and David was replying to that a moment ago. The fact is, of course, that nothing significant can really be done about improving productivity until we deal with the ball and chain that's been around our neck since 1903, somewhat reduced in weight in the last 20 or 30 years, although the weight is increasing once again now under Gillard's Fair Work Act, and that is the industrial relations system. The whole system of regulation is the most important single thing which is holding Australia back. And not only is it doing that, but it's also having the most appalling distributional effects, if you like, because the people who are most hurt by it are people like Aboriginals, young people, and generally speaking, people without skills and education. They're the ones who cannot, because of minimum wage limits and award wages, they can't get jobs. And if we could ever get politicians who could articulate the sheer infamy of that outcome, then we might get somewhere. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, John. I might address your first point, and then I'll hand over to these guys to talk about productivity and economic growth. The reason why it's not called Target 25 or even lower is because, as Václav Klaus, the Czech president, put it, the forces of smaller government are not currently on the winning side. We're looking at a very real situation where if we continue on the way that we are at the moment, that we'll get to 50% of GDP. And in that sense, what we're really talking about here is two choices. You can have 30% of GDP or you can have 50% of GDP. At the moment, there does not really seem to be any impetus for smaller government on either side of politics. And there are a lot of very serious and very challenging barriers between us and those sort of goals. Now, one of the things that we'd love to see from Target 30 is a serious discussion about the role of government in society, and that once Target 30 was finished, that we would continue on with the sort of things that have led us to have smaller government in the first place. You know, some of the institutional changes around new spending programs so that they're independently reviewed, so that what doesn't happen is that we then go back up to 40% in another 10 years. But I appreciate your point about 25% might be better, and I mean, it's something that's exercised more than one person in the CIS as well. But from my perspective, I think I'd rather 30 than 50, and that's where we're headed at the moment. David?
In terms of productivity and labour, the notion in 1903, I think it was, of comparative wage justice, combined with the arbitration process, really set up a one-sided arrangement in which if a union could remain in dispute, which when you think about it, it's not very hard to do, particularly if you come from Ireland like I do, then you keep getting arbitration. And arbitration is, I hope there's no lawyers here, it's like spinning the chocolate wheel. If you miss first time, you make another dispute and go again. It is a horribly adversarial way of conducting any employment process. And what we found useful at the Commonwealth Bank was to change that around and say, we stand for fair, challenging and rewarding work. That's, the employer stands for that. The lawyers told us, don't do this. But we said, how could any person any employee require protection from its own employer? That's an outrageous suggestion. So the way to build engagement is for employers to work by themselves towards that goal. The reason it doesn't happen often is that a lot of people in the HR process come from this legalistic background and they see HR as IR. And that, in industry, that needs to change substantially. 21 years of continuous growth is not a good background for that change to be forced upon industry, but that will change.
Morris, anything to add?
Well, of course, John is right. I mean, the lower the number that government is as a percentage of the of GDP, the better. There may be a level around 20%, we could argue, when we get there. But I think the other point which is being missed is not just the productivity of labour, it's the productivity of capital. And what we are finding now is that so much productive capital is being consumed by recurrent spending. And that is gone. It's like going on a holiday, borrowing from the bank. You've had a nice holiday, but there's no capital when you come back. You've got to pay it back. And I think this is one of the issues that is likely to lead to slower growth around the world, because we are inexorably consuming productive capital. Moreover, if you look at what is happening, particularly in Europe and the United States, we're encouraging speculation, so we're getting people out of, because there is no return on holding what we used to consider anyway secure assets. Question whether some of these sovereign assets are secure anymore. But we're getting people to go out along the risk curve, and to the extent that we're going to go through another period like we had in 2007, 2008, again you're destroying productive capital. I think it's a very serious issue about which very little is spoken, and let alone very much is looked at within government. But it's as important as it is having productive labour.
Yep. Hi Simon, hi panel, it's Julie Novak. The economist Peter Bottker has on a number of occasions enunciated what he would describe as a classical liberal policy agenda for the 21st century. These broadly constitute a few things, but two of which would include an active divestiture by government of roles and responsibilities to business and civil society more broadly. Another key principle is the decentralisation of functions, roles and activities within government. That is a radical decentralisation from central governments to lower levels of government. Particularly interested, without obviously you foretelling what you might sort of divulge in future work under this program, I'm interested in finding out where you think the balance might tend to lie in terms of actual divestiture by government of functions versus a decentralisation. The reason why I ask is that, intriguingly, in your paper, you suggest a national health reform program.
Thanks very much for that, Julie, and I'll try and answer that very quickly, and perhaps we can talk about that more later. I think the answer is probably going to be both of those functions, as you might expect. One of the problems I think we've seen in recent times is not only have we got a centralisation of functions of government, and increasingly the Commonwealth government is dominating all of the conversation, we've actually seen a duplication of functions at a variety of different levels. So we've got a Commonwealth Department of Education with thousands of employees and no teachers, and we've got a Commonwealth Department of Health with thousands of employees and no hospitals. So we would like to see, and I think that's fairly consistent with a lot of what we've argued, we'd like to see the states being responsible for the states' functions and the Commonwealth for the Commonwealth functions. But within that framework, we also think there's a lot of scope for the private sector to take over some of these functions and perform them more efficiently, especially in terms of health. I think that there's a lot of scope for private hospitals and private health insurance and you know, private sector funding of health to really improve efficiency in that level. Obviously something we could talk about a lot more, but just try and get as best we can through these questions. So
it's a powerful message that we're going to hell in a handcart, and that we're just on the go back sign, and it's a powerful message, and I believe that it's a very necessary one. My problem is, the underlying question is, what's different? I can't actually remember a time when people haven't said that government spending is too high. I can't remember a time when government spending has been efficient. If there needs to be a message, if we're going to have a program, then we need to say what's different this time, and to be honest about whether there is anything different this time. It's natural. I don't go to my doctor without being told to exercise more and eat less. I need to know if the message is any different. I always listen, and it's a good message, but I need to know if it's different this time. It's very strange to hear it now, because there are a number of reasons why it doesn't gel with the general perception of how we are. Commodity prices are high, and we're a big mine. Unemployment is low, and therefore that dreadful drag that we see in Europe of the government having to pay people not to work isn't such an issue here. The cost of capital is low, so actually to get equipment in to dig our stuff up should be cheap. There's a high Australian dollar, so when we have to import mining equipment and stuff, it should be a great time. And we have our wonderful means-tested welfare system, which is the envy of the world. So what's the problem? I believe there is a problem. I believe we need to address the question, what is different? Have the standards of public administration dropped significantly over this dreadful chart that goes up? Or is it the fact that we are now too generous in our welfare? Because if the underlying message is that we are going to pay the old less and we're going to have less for hospitals, we need to say it and we need to be able to explain why that's the case. We can't soften it by saying, oh yes, we're just going to be more efficient, we're going to do things and that's going to solve it, because that is, I'm sorry, with all respect, that is the underlying background, always necessary message, but what's new about it? I believe the elements that are new are the ageing population and the rising healthcare costs. I believe there are really, really disturbing trends related to the change in dependency ratios, the issue as to the size of population, as to what we're going to do about it with issues of immigration and whatever, which really deserve focused attention, really sharp attention, which the CIS does give, and that's one of the reasons I support the CIS, because we need the attention on it. But please, please, if we're going to have a programme, can we please be clear what's different about the message and what really is the underlying point that we want to get over? Thank you very much.
Excellent. Look, thank you very much for that. If I can answer that very, very briefly. I think the difference about this campaign is that we are not just saying we need smaller government and government spending is too high. We're saying that we should be cutting in these specific areas, and we're going to outline in a paper on welfare and a paper on health and a paper on education exactly what we mean when we say smaller government. But I think you're right, and you touched on the key points there. We are looking at, in the next 30 years, identified in documents produced by the government, by Treasury, there is going to be an enormous pressure on our budgets, on our future generations, on our taxes, that's going to come from an ageing population and rising healthcare costs. And it's something that really will impact everywhere across the world and hasn't been felt yet anywhere. And it is something that will challenge Australia. You're right, Australia is in a good position compared to the rest of the world, mostly because we've avoided some of the worst excesses that we've seen in places like Europe. But the underlying trends are still there, and those future problems, they're not going to go away. The majority of increases in government spending have come from new programs. Over the last 10 years, 75% of Commonwealth government increases have come from new programs. In the future, it's the existing programs that are going to be the problem, because they're going to have to deal with an enormous influx of older people with rising healthcare needs and rising healthcare costs, and it's a significant issue.
Simon, could I just intervene?
Absolutely.
Just very quickly. A couple of things are different. First of all, our cousins are in serious financial difficulties. Their health, you were saying you go to the doctor and it tells you the same thing. Well, you now have absolutely wonderful examples in Europe, in the United States, of what happens when you take these things to excess. 11 states, the United States, there are more people dependent on welfare than there are in employment. The other thing is we have to stop rewarding learned helplessness. And that is what is, every time you look around, we feel so-called compassion for people who are struggling for whatever reason. Usually the reason is because there's a safety net there, which means there is no incentive to get out there and start doing some hard work.
Can I say I very much agree with what you're saying. I think society would be better, the economy better, and people are happier if government was small. Nonetheless, over my professional life, over the past 40 years, governments have got bigger. The reason for that is when it came to the choice, governments thought the electorates would prefer more spending and more regulation to lower taxes and lower regulation. How are you going to change their mind?
Thank you for that. Exactly, and I think Greg puts it there, hard work. We're going to document as best we can what we think the outcomes will be, and we're going to put the evidence out there, and we're going to try and let people convince themselves of that. But importantly, I think this is a campaign. It's an ongoing campaign for smaller government. We're going to be out there talking about this again and again and again until people start getting the message. It's not going to be a one-off thing where we put this out there and then we move on to something else. This is an ongoing campaign for the CIS, and hopefully it's going to have the effect that we want.
Can I just say one thing about that question? A year and a half ago, if you look at a bar chart of government debt plus the present value of future commitments for welfare, health, age pensions and so on, for the range of Eurozone countries in the United States, the highest on the bar chart of all of them was the United States. And the United States is running a current account deficit as well. Big budget deficit, current account deficit. Europe had lower readings than the United States and had a current account in balance, thanks to Germany, of course. But the lowest on that bar chart was Spain. Can you explain to me why people in Spain have got a 50% unemployment rate for their youth? If that's not enough to get people thinking, we should not be sitting here watching that and then be following the same approach to public policy and assume we're going to be okay.